Hello again. In the last podcast, I dived into a bit of detail on lenses, which I hope you found useful if you listen to it. And if you get confused by some of the ways lenses are described when you go to buy one or specify one. So in this podcast, I thought I'd just step back and look at a few more photography terms. So I'm going to start with lenses, I guess, just to build on what I spoke about last time. And basically, there are three types I'm going to talk about, and you spoke about two in the last episode. So a prime lens basically is a lens that only has a single focal length. So it's a 100mm lens or it's 400mm lens, whatever it is, that's it. So it's only gives you one focal distance, which means one amount of magnification and one particular angle of view. So that's a prime lens. So it's just a fixed focal length. Now, primes are actually very good lenses on the whole. They'll tend to give you more a better aperture, which I'll come to, which means that you can shoot faster, which means they're often referred to as a fast lens, which is another term. And a fast lens is simply a lens that has a bigger aperture, and the aperture is the hole basically in the lens that allows light through. And when that's a large one, it means that you can use a much faster shutter speed in a given situation than you can using a lens with a smaller aperture, which kind of makes sense because it's letting in less light. So those get known as fast lenses. So that's a prime lens. A zoom lens, obviously, I say obviously, but I think most of us come across a zoom lens, and it simply means you have a range of focal lengths. So it might be 24 to 240 is a lens that I specified last time. So that's a 10 times magnification. Obviously, you can pick any focal length within that range of 24mm to 240. And depending on what you're photographing, that might be a much more useful lens to have than a lens with a single focal length. So, for example, with wildlife photography, I tend to use two zoom lenses, wide angle zoom, and which is 28 to 135, I think. I can never remember the numbers. And the 100 to 400 is my go-to. So I've got that overlap in focal lengths. So that gives me quite a nice range. But it means that for any given subject, I can decide how close I want to zoom in to how much I want to magnify my subject and just shoot with that focal length. But the downside is the aperture on that zoom lens is smaller than I would get on any prime lens using any of those focal lengths. So that's the downside, less light, slower shutter speed. But it is lighter and it's very flexible because I don't have to remove a lens from the camera and put another one on before I take my photograph. So these are just things to consider when you're thinking about what type of lens to have. So if you're working in a studio as an example, and you always want the same amount of magnification on your subject, then a standard lens is absolutely ideal for you, because that will normally standard lenses give you a higher quality result. I'm going to be a little bit cautious with that, but on the whole, I think that's a fair comment. You can expect to have let's say a sharper image, maybe. Definitely something that gives you the option to have a faster shutter speed, as I've already said. So that's a prime lens and a zoom lens. Now, the other lens that I didn't talk about, although I did refer to it last week, and that's a standard lens. And a standard lens is, in the case of a 35mm system or a DSLR using a full frame sensor, which is the same as a 35mm frame, that would be a 50mm lens. And the reason that we refer to that, so the reason we have the standard lens, is that gives you the same magnification that you would experience by looking at something with your eyes. So it's basically the same view that you would get with the naked eye. So that's what a standard lens is. So in the old days, I don't think they do it now, but in the old days, when you bought a camera, you would often have, or if you had a camera and a body and lens combination, it would often be a camera with a standard prime lens. So that is a lens that had a fixed focal length of 50mm. Okay, so I hope that's clarified things a little bit. I hope so. So what I've done, I've spoken about focal length. I've spoken a little bit about aperture, so I might expand on that very slightly, but I did that in some depth last time. So as I've said, aperture is really how big the hole is that the light is coming through. And what I spoke about last time was how that's specified, and that's as an F number, and an F number is essentially a fraction of the full diameter of the lens. So f2 is quite a big hole because it's 1/2. It's half the diameter, whereas f16, 1/16, is a much smaller hole. So that's how those numbers come about, and that's what they mean. Another thing to think about is depth of field. So depth of field is a phrase that you probably have heard of, and hopefully you understand it. But if you don't, it's really important to understand it because depth of field plays a big role in creative photography. So with your lens, you've focused on your subject, and that gives you a focal distance. So that's the distance between your subject and the sensor in your camera. So that's the distance that the lens has to deliver for you. So that's your focal distance. The depth of field is what's in focus in front of your subject and behind your subject. And what that amounts to depends on the aperture. So, for example, if you are using an aperture of f2, you're going to have what we would refer to as a very narrow depth of field, which means that something that can be in front of your subject but quite close to it can begin to go out of focus. And equally on the other side, so behind your subject where you're focusing, some distance behind that subject, things will begin to go out of focus. Now, what that distance actually is depends on several things. It depends on, first of all, how far away you are from your subject. It depends on the performance of the lens that you have, and it also depends on the aperture that you've chosen. So those factors will influence what the actual depth of field is. The reason depth of field is important, and this is a question I used to get asked quite a lot when I was just doing photo walks, is this thing about how do you get a photograph where your subject is nice and sharp but the background's out of focus? That was the normal question, and that is all down to depth of field. So if you are not familiar with using this and you have a camera where you can vary your aperture, the thing to do is to switch to aperture priority. And if you don't know how to do that, take my course. But if you switch to aperture priority, then it just means that you set the aperture and the camera does the rest for you. But set it to the biggest hole that you can get. So that would be the smallest F number. So it might be f2, might be f2.8. It might be smaller than that. It might be f1.8 or something like that. But shoot a subject that's, let's say, 10 to 20 meters away from you with that aperture. And then change your aperture to f16. Don't change your position, but take exactly the same photograph. And you'll see the difference in depth of field. So when you get to the bigger numbers, the bigger fraction numbers, so f16, so that's 1/16 of the diameter of the that you're letting light through. So it's a much smaller hole. f22 is even smaller. What happens, because the way the optics work, is that with that smaller aperture, much more of what you're seeing is in focus. And in fact, when you get down to f22, pretty much everything that you can see will be in focus. So if you do want your foreground and background in sharp focus as well as your subject, then go for f22. If you just want your subject in focus and things in front of and behind that subject out of focus, then choose something closer to f8, f5.6. Then, in a practical sense, they would tend to be the sort of numbers you'll most commonly use. So, but that's what depth of field is, and it is really important if you want to start creating really engaging photographs that you understand how to use it. So, I definitely would recommend that. Dynamic range is another one. And it's simply the difference. So if you look at any photograph, you're going to have an area that's very bright or is brighter than the rest, and an area that's darker than the rest. And simply the dynamic range is the difference between the brightest part of the image and the darkest part of the image. And if you're photographing something on a very dull, overcast day, there may not be that much difference. I mean, it obviously depends on what you're photographing, but let's say it's a tree. There might not be that much difference between the brightest part of the image and the darkest part of the image. But if you're photographing something, let's say a car with silver wheels and a black car with bright silver wheels, if you're photographing that on a very bright day, obviously the shiny parts, the silver parts, are going to be very bright in the image, and the dark, particularly if it's a matte black sort of a color, that won't be that will be quite dark. So there'll be a much bigger difference between the brightest part of the image and the darkest part. And if you have a digital camera that has a graph on the back, that is essentially what it's showing you. It's showing you the dynamic range, and it's showing you how much of the image is in the sort of brightest area, how much is in the darkest, and how much is in the middle bit. So to get a good exposure, you really want that to be a reasonably flat curve, if that makes sense. So avoiding large areas that are very bright and very dark. Otherwise, it can be quite tricky getting the right result for you. And I'm thinking of something like an animal on a bright day, but where their eye is very shaded, which, if you think about it, that's what we tend to do. We try and keep our eyes out of bright sunlight so we can actually see with them. So in that situation, trying to get the exposure right for the eye might mean that you burn out a lot of the rest of the image because that's in bright sunlight. So I hope that's making a bit of sense. But that's essentially what the dynamic range is about. It's the difference between the brightest and the darkest part of the image. And you just need to manage that a little bit in situations where you have very strong light and very dark areas, just to make sure you can get some kind of exposure that exposes at least the parts of the image that you want to have correctly exposed. Okay, another thing to think about is noise. So that's another one I'm going to briefly cover. So I'll tend to talk about noise when it comes to the exposure triangle. So as I said, last podcast I spoke about focal length, and I was talking about aperture quite a lot. And obviously how that aperture influences the range of shutter speeds you have available to get a correct exposure and to either freeze the action that you're photographing or to have a bit of movement in there. Fast shutter speed tends to be more of an issue when you're trying to freeze the action, because you tend to be looking at thousandths of a second or up around the thousandth of a second. And depending on how much light is available and how fast your lens is, so hopefully you remember what that means, that means you may or may not be able to achieve your ideal shutter speed with a fairly low ISO number. Now, hopefully you remember ISO, or if you don't know, this will be news, but ISO simply is a way of defining how sensitive your sensor is in the camera. And it used to refer to the sensitivity of a roll of film in the days of film. So obviously that was the whole roll would be shot at that speed, or you might push it or pull it, if you remember those terms, if you were using film. In the digital world, we've got it much easier because we can change the ISO for every frame we shoot. So we can either make the sensor more sensitive to the light coming in or less sensitive, which means that we can avoid over or underexposing our image using a given aperture and shutter speed combination. So it may well be that if you've got a lens that is relatively slow lens and means that you have to use a relatively slow shutter speed to get the correct exposure, you can increase the shutter speed a little bit by just making the ISO number higher. So in other words, you're making the sensor more sensitive to light. So that allows you to use faster shutter speed in a given situation. However, you might well ask, well, if that's the case, why don't you just have a very high ISO all the time? Because then you can use very fast shutter speeds in any situation. And that's a reasonable question. The reason we don't do that is that as you increase the ISO, what happens is we get more noise in the image. And what we mean by noise is the ability to see pixels in the final image. And the pixels are obviously these little squares on the computer screen that have a little block of color. So that's how we make up the image. And with a very low ISO number, those pixels, you can't really see them. It's quite fine. The colors just kind of blend, and it looks pretty much, the image looks pretty much as it would to your naked eye. But as you push that ISO up, the noise increases in what gets recorded in the sensor, which means that those little pixels become more obvious. So they get bigger, they combine, and you start to get an image that, if you look at it, particularly an area in the image that's one solid color. So if you're shooting, say, a landscape and you've got a lot of blue sky, if you've had to push up your ISO for some reason, you'll begin to see that the sky, you'll see little speckles in the blue, and that's the noise. They're the pixels starting to stand out, and it's due to noise in the sensor caused by heat and all this kind of thing. So I'm not going to get into all of that, but essentially the thing to remember from a practical standpoint is that the higher you push the ISO, yes, you can get a faster shutter speed, but you will get a noisier image. So it will start to become less smooth. And if you blow it up without doing anything to remove the noise, those pixels will become very obvious. And the only way to describe it is that the image will look grainy. So going back to the old days of film and newspaper print, particularly when we had the black and white pictures. If you remember, newspaper print looked very grainy. It was very kind of a coarse-looking image, not very smooth, not glossy, not like the kind of image you would see in a glossy magazine. So that, if you want that kind of a look, you need to be at a low ISO number. And as I say, as you go higher, you get a grainier result. Okay, and the final thing, so this is a relatively short podcast, but I just wanted to cover off just a few more terms, really, just to because I think the problem with photography is that it does get into a lot of jargon, and jargon has its place. If you're, one photographer to another, using a bit of jargon can get quite a lot of information across from one person to the other if you both understand it. But if you don't understand the jargon, then you don't know what on earth they're talking about. So the final thing I want to talk about is back button focus. Now, the reason I want to talk about that is that it is something that I speak about on webinars. I'm sure I've mentioned it on podcasts before. So what's that all about? Well, when you get your camera from the factory or the shop, if it's been just set back to factory settings, the way that the autofocus works, so I'm talking about obviously a camera with an autofocus lens, and in fact the way when the camera measures the amount of light coming in and calculates exposure, that happens when you push the shutter button halfway down. So if you're not familiar with this, just try pushing the shutter button halfway down. You'll feel it it doesn't lock, but you can feel it kind of click. You can feel it hit something halfway down. And that's what's doing. It's basically the switch is operating to tell the camera, okay, take the light reading now, and also set the AF, the autofocus point. And that autofocus point will be set by you in an autofocus menu somewhere, or if not, it might be a zone focus. So and that's an actually important thing to get right, because you do need to tell the camera where you want what you want it to focus on. And if you're photographing something like wildlife, where there might be an awful lot of other things in front of and behind your subject that could confuse the camera if it's trying to decide where it needs to focus, then I always set mine cameras for the smallest AF point, and I set the one in the center of the viewfinder. Now that's fine, but if you're using the shutter button to determine your focus point, it means that it will only focus on what's dead center of the viewfinder, and that's a pretty boring picture, frankly. So if you've been to one of my composition webinars, then you'll know that that's not something that I get terribly excited about. So one way around that, and there are others, but one way of doing that is to use a thing called back button focus. And I use that on my cameras. And what it is, if you've got a camera, a DSLR or mirrorless with little buttons on the back of the body, now they might be used for different things. They'll be allocated to different things. But in the menu on a lot of cameras, now I can't guarantee it will be like this on yours, but in the menu, if you sort of plod through to the right menu page, you'll find that you can reallocate the function of some of those buttons on the back. And one of the common things to do is to set the focus. So where you set the focus, rather than it being pressing the shutter button halfway down, you actually change the autofocus, a kind of setting point, if you like, to one of those buttons on the back. So that is known as back button focus, because you've reprogrammed one of the buttons on the back of the camera, and that now sets your focus. So I tend to use my thumb on one of those, on the button that I program. So while I'm looking at my subject through the viewfinder, I'll stick the subject right in the center. And when I'm in that mode, the camera will also illuminate in the viewfinder that particular focus point, AF point. I'll then press the back button to set the focus, but then I can back off and I can then reframe the shot and use the shutter button to actually take the image, take the photograph I want. So I find it a very convenient way of setting the focus. And if the distance between you and your subject is not changing between different shots, it does mean that you set the focus once and then you can just go away, recompose, do whatever you want to do. You could do, portrait, formatted shot of your subject. You can do a landscape formats. You can move the camera around. You can zoom in, zoom out, all those kind of things. But your focus is already set. So you don't have to worry about upsetting the focus. Whereas using the shutter button, if there are a lot of, let's say, trees or branches or things like that between you and your subject or behind, sometimes the camera will latch onto the wrong thing. And all of a sudden, your subject has gone out of focus unintentionally. So that's what back button focus is. Now, I don't always recommend that you use it. It really depends on what you're photographing. So if you are photographing subjects where it's quite tricky to keep the camera correctly focused using autofocus, then I'd suggest you think about it. And if you do switch to back button focus, you really want to practice a little bit initially just to get used to using it, because if you've been using the camera for a while, you'll be used to just setting the focus using the shutter button. So switching to another button on the back, you do have to think about it for a little while until it becomes second nature. And as I've said with mine, if you've got more than one body, I recommend that you just change all of your camera bodies if you can to use back button focus. So if you're switching between cameras quickly, you don't have to start thinking about what you need to do on that particular camera. So I've got a couple of Canons. I've got a Canon EOS 5DS and an EOS 7D Mark II. And the controls on those two are almost identical. So it's very easy. So I set the same button on both to do my back button focus. And it's very easy for me just to switch from one to the other. So, as I say, that's it for this one. So I just really wanted to talk through a little bit more about lenses, because it can get a little bit confusing about what's what. I've also spoken about dynamic range. I've spoken about what a fast lens is, and I've covered back button focus. So there's just a few things to in there that you may not be familiar with, and you might have heard the term. So hopefully that's useful. And I will speak to you again in the next podcast. So bye for now. Oh, and one thing just before you go, please take a look at the 2026 wildlife calendar. That's available now. It's on the website. There's a link below the description of this podcast episode. So please take a look, and I'll speak to you next time. Bye now.